label it, and that is doing, what it looks like at the level of an Ivy League college. And tonight, our main host, our impresario for the evening, is going to be Declan Kunkel. Okay, so I will just turn over the event to Declan. He is our mystery alumnus who graduated in 2019. Take it away, Declan.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Happy to be here, and thank you for the introduction. We're excited to talk about cancel culture tonight. As everyone knows, it's something that's been playing a larger and larger role in political discourse. In January of this year, students and alumni from Harvard's Kennedy School of Public Policy started a petition to, quote, revoke the degrees of alumni whose incendiary language and subversion of the democratic processes, rooted in a history of white supremacist voter suppression, incited the insurrection on January 6th, end quote. And of course, Yale, only a few days later, started to have similar calls where alumni called on Twitter and on various online platforms for rescinding degrees of so Abigail Schreier, who's come to prominence in recent years, had to respond to calls for her own Ivy League diploma to be revoked because people took exception to her book, which is called Irreversible Damage. And so we used to have to worry about cancel culture, and certainly that's still true. But now we see more and more that even institutions are under pressure to not just cancel their alumni, but actually take away their degrees. And so that's the topic we'll be covering tonight. And we have some very distinguished guests that I'm happy to introduce now. The first of which is Eric Metaxas, who graduated from Yale in 1984, where he was a Class A speaker and won a number of awards for his writing. He was the editor of the Yale Record, the nation's oldest college humor magazine. Since then, he's written many books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller Bonhoeffer, and hosts the nationally syndicated Eric Metaxas Show and Socrates in the City. His most recent book, Fish Out of Water, A Search for the Meaning of Life, touches on his time at Yale, among other things. For more, please visit www.ericmetaxas.com. Our second guest is John Zmirak, who graduated from Yale's Brantford College in 1986. While on campus, he was the editor-in-chief of the Yale Free Press. He later completed a PhD in literature from Louisiana State University. He's the editor at Stream, where his columns run nearly daily. As a bold commentator on Catholic issues, he's known for having authored books like The Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism. And finally, our third guest is Bobby Lopez, who graduated from Yale Saybrook College in 1993. While on campus, Bobby founded Kasama, the campus Filipino organization, in 1989, which remains active today. From his position there, he organized a summit in 1991 with 33 colleges and took the lead in founding and writing the Constitution for FIND, an intercollegiate Filipino organization that remains strong 30 years later. He spent the next 20 years teaching at universities. And before we dive into our discussion tonight, if the points resonate with you as Yale alumni, we're starting a alumni organization for Patriots, and the email to send us an email if you'd like to get on our list is the number 4 God, 4 country, 4 Yale at protonmail.com. Again, if you're interested in joining a group for patriotic Yale alumni, please go to 4 God, 4 country, 4 Yale at protonmail.com. So with that introduction and introductions out of the way, we're going to structure the evening's call with 10-minute discussion segments followed by 5-minute supplementary statements. And if you write in questions, we'll be able to take those from the chat and save some time at the end to address everybody's points. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Eric to kick us off and get us started on our discussion of cancel culture and canceling degrees at Yale and Ivy League schools.
Declan, thank you very much. I confess when I was your age, I was afraid of public speaking. Now it's almost all I do, even privately. I graduated Yale in '84, and the book that you mentioned, which is just out, so I'm kind of excited to talk at least obliquely about the book. But in the book, Fish Out of Water, I talk about some of my experiences at Yale, which touch on what we're talking about here. Part of the reason the book is titled Fish Out of Water is because I come from a working class background. My mom and dad are from Europe. My dad came from Greece. My mom came from Germany. And so, to be the first one in my family to go to college was just an exciting thing. And I went to Yale really with not only stars in my eyes, but I think really maybe naive, but nonetheless innocent expectations that I would learn about truth. I knew that Yale's motto was Lux et Veritas, light and truth. And I had a really innocent hope that I would be able to learn from the great writers and thinkers of the past. That in the late 70s or the early 80s, that was not a crazy thing. And I was looking forward to it. I was really excited about it. When I got there, the reason I felt a little bit like a fish out of water was because I bumped into what we really might call the PC culture, the politically correct culture. Now it's the woke culture, the cancel culture. But I had been absolutely unaware of it up to that point. Again, if you grow up in a working class European immigrant home, you're just normal folks. The whole idea of the cultural elite world that says, well, you can't say that, and we don't do that here, and that wasn't really where I was coming from. My parents came here from places where you're not free. My mother came from East Germany. My dad experienced the war in Greece and the communists, trying to take over in Greece after the war. So they really raised me to love freedom, to love America, to be proud of America. And so when I got to Yale, suddenly I bumped into the world that we all now know, which barely existed, but was, like many things, beginning at Yale. It started there. And I remember, a couple of incidents. I was class day speaker, which for those who are listening who aren't familiar with Yale, at Yale graduation, the day before graduation takes place in the residential colleges. So you've got 12 residential colleges now. There's 14 or whatever, and basically graduation takes place in these the little residential college. So it's kind of like more of a local thing. But class day, the day before, takes place on old campus. So you've got 10,000 people out there in this beautiful quadrangle. And on class day, I, along with my dear friend Chris Haynes, we were the editors of the Yale Record, the humor magazine, and we'd been chosen to give the class day speech, which was irreverent in a number of ways. And what I find interesting, actually, is that the theme of our class day speech in 1984 at graduation was that Yale had, during our time there, gotten more uptight. We didn't use the word uptight. We used another word. But it was kind of interesting that already then we could sort of see this march toward political correctness. And neither of us at the time was any kind of a conservative, certainly not an evangelical Christian or anything like that. But we could just see it. And something in us, I would say, the humorists, the comedians, the people who edited the Yale Record, which was irreverent from its founding in 1872, we bristled at that feeling that we're not really free to say what we want. We've got to be careful. It's fascinating because it didn't really break along lines of Democrat or Republican or traditional or anything like that. And I remember that day also. We were this is just classic. You think that it happened today, but there was a movement to divest the class funds from South Africa. And then there was some other movement having to do with the union of the Yale workers or something like that. I don't know. All I knew was there was only one side of the issue to be on. And if you didn't wear your little ribbon showing solidarity with the union, or the other ribbon showing solidarity with the idea that you were against, that you were for taking your funds out of South Africa, if you didn't do that, you were bad. You had to do that. You had to do that to show you were on the right side. It's like, posting the BLM square or the rainbow flag out of the church. Like, if you don't do that, people look at you like you're funny. What's wrong with you? Are you a bigot? Where are you coming from? And I'll never forget that pressure. Unlike somebody like John Zmirak, I went along with the crowd. I didn't want to rock the boat. And so I remember wearing those ribbons, and I'm pretty sure Chris Haynes, who today is politically liberal, but at the time, I just remember him bristling at it and realizing it's PC nonsense. I'm not going to wear that because they tell me to wear that. Another thing that I remember happening, actually, all I want to say really was that pressure existed at the time. So this is something that's been at Yale for a long, long time. But I just want to go backwards and say that we have to ask, where does this come from? Where does this cancel culture come from? This is really cultural Marxism, whatever it is. You see it in the French Revolution. It's antithetical to American-style freedom and self-government. There's something about it which it seems to surface in atheist environments. When I say atheist, I mean in governments that are sort of anti-God or anti-clerical. But at Yale, I will never forget this. I'll close with this. I write about it in my book, I should say, Fish Out of Water. But I say that the library at Yale, again, people who are unfamiliar with Yale wouldn't know this, but Sterling Memorial Library was built in 1926. Just before it was built, Yale had decided in the 20s to no longer have mandatory chapel, which is interesting, right? Yale was already drifting. Buckley writes about it. This didn't start to happen in the 60s or the 80s. This was already happening in the 20s, so you can trace it back. But Yale had decided no more mandatory chapel. This was not something they wanted to do. So the person who designed the library, in effect, said, why don't we make the library like a cathedral to learning, a cathedral to secular knowledge? And so the Yale Sterling Memorial Library looks completely like a cathedral. When you look at it from the outside, it looks like Chartres Cathedral. It was modeled on European cathedrals. And so people at the time thought this was a little bit irreverent. I mean, it's not a cathedral, it's just a library. But when you walk into it, the whole architectural idea continues. You walk, it looks like a nave. You're walking down the center of a cathedral, and at the end, the circulation desk is made to look like an altar. I'm not making this up. The architect did this intentionally because he wanted to secularize these ideas. He wanted to make a temple to secular learning. And then the altar mural, which is what the architect calls it, the altar mural above the circulation desk, you think it's Mary, but you look closer, it's not Mary. It is alma mater. It is Yale. So this is an altar to Yale, to secular learning. And there's just something at least a little bit creepy. People were offended at the time. Where's Yale going? Why is Yale drifting away from God? What is Yale up to? When you make a right of the circulation desk, there are a number of carvings. It looks like a cloistered walk. And obviously these were carved, in the mid-20s, but, it looks like they was carved in the 14th century. And there are 4 carvings of student life. And these are, bas-relief at the top of a pillar. And one of them is a student with a mug of beer, and he's like falling asleep. So it's kind of making fun of student life, right? The next one is a student who's supposed to be studying, but he's looking at a curvaceous pinup on the wall, and I think listening to the radio. The third one, I don't remember, but it's something similar. But the fourth one is the only student who is studying. And the student who is studying has in front of him a book opened, and the book on the left-hand side has the letters U and an R and an A. And on the right-hand side, it has a J and an O, and beneath that, a K and an E. So if you look at it, the student who is studying sees you are a joke. Now, at first, it seems ha-ha funny, and it's meant to be ha-ha funny, and it's irreverent. But to me, where all of this is coming from, if we're going to trace it back, all that is happening at Yale, the cancel culture, everything, comes from this idea of secularism, which effectively says, since Darwin, that we are in fact accidents. And that if you really want to know what's the meaning of life, if you're hungry for the meaning of life, you will discover, if you want to study the book, you will discover that you are in fact a cosmic joke, that you're an accident, that the universe sort of threw you up out of the primordial soup by accident, random mutations. You got here by accident. Your life has no meaning. You don't really want to know that. But if you want to know that, if you really do want to study and look into it, that's what you'll find. And now it's kind of chilling to me because I think that's where all this stuff comes from. The idea that your life is not, your existence has not been superintended or intended by God. You're just here, and you've got to make the most of the best of it. And basically, the best of it is have some fun, drink some beer, women, radio, whatever it is, have fun, have some pleasure, because there's no God. Pleasure is guilt-free. And by the way, if you don't do that and you focus on why you're here, if you really want to study and look into this, you're not going to be happy with the answer. And I just remember finding that chilling, because it's basically saying life really is meaningless. You've got Darwin, then Freud tells us that the libido, it's just about perpetuating the species. So the whole thing points to this really grim, nihilist kind of idea. And it's effectively telling you, you don't really want to talk about that, do you? So let's just have a good time. I think that's the root of where all of this comes from. I've gone over already, but I just thought, let me lay that out. And now we'll go to Bobby or John.
Thank you very much, Eric. We'll turn it over to John for your opening. Thanks, John.
Overlapping with you, so I have a lot of the same memories. I'll say that the only button I wore at Yale was a homemade button I had with the double-headed eagle that said, "Restore the Habsburgs." So I was clearly desperate to fit in with everybody else at Yale. I think false religion is at the heart of this. I love Sterling Memorial. As a Catholic, I did instinctively genuflect at the circulation desk once, and I used to love to use the phone booths, which look like old-fashioned confessionals. But false religion is what we're talking about now. Wokeism, the woke ideology, which when we were at Yale was political correctness. And by the way, that was before the term was used ironically. People would say that's politically incorrect, the way they would say that's mathematically incorrect or that's factually incorrect. It was only later people started rolling their eyes and saying, oh, PC. No, they meant it with deadly Stalinist earnestness when they came up with it. And by the way, the faculty were not like this at the time when I was at Yale. It was the students and some of the grad students who taught. I wonder what the faculty are like now, but I found the faculty at Yale when I was there, while very liberal, mostly extremely tolerant. And so I never had trouble with the profs. But wokeism has all the intolerance and all the narrowness of Puritanism without the good intentions or genuine faith. I don't like to use the term puritanical negatively or pejoratively, because it's unfair. The Puritans were doing their best under grim conditions to create a genuine Christian society. They had their flaws, they're fallen like the rest of us. The new Puritanism is an attempt to create a sense of meaning, of morality, of who's in and who's out, who's a sinner and who's justified, based on absolutely nothing. These people who vigorously assert Darwinian evolution, the ruthless survival of the fittest, as the source of the existence of all higher life, then they want us to believe that racism is wrong. Well, why was racism wrong for chimpanzees and gorillas? You don't believe in human exceptionalism. Why should there be American exceptionalism where we pretend that we all have infinite dignity? They want to take the morality of the civil rights movement, which comes straight out of the Bible, straight out of Christianity, comes from nowhere else. They want that morality, and they want to apply it to transgender people and people who identify as animals. But then they want the metaphysics of Charles Darwin. And of course, the person who took Charles Darwin most seriously in politics was Adolf Hitler. He was to Charles Darwin what Lenin was to Marx, the person who took the ideas seriously and implemented them politically. People don't like to think that. People don't like to admit that. They want, apparently, a rigid, even stifling ecclesiastical hierarchy. They want a rigid code of right and wrong. They want to feel a sense of conversion, a sense of awakening, hence the term woke. They want that. They just want it without many or most of the terms of Christian morality. They don't want any sexual restrictions. They don't want to be told they can't invest in China and use products made by Uyghur slaves or wear cotton picked by Uyghur slaves on plantations. That's happening right now, folks. And if you bring it up, nobody wants to hear about that. They want to talk about if a Hollywood star didn't get a high enough salary compared to people of different ethnic groups. They want to talk about glitzy, fun, glamorous things. They want cheap grace. They want grace at a rock bottom bargain price that has no impact on their personal lives, that costs them nothing. They want open borders. Let everyone come to America, because you know what? There's not going to be a mass influx of journalists and attorneys and diversity consultants that are going to take their jobs. That's going to affect blue collar people who they can look down on and think, oh, they're gross. They're racist. The term racist has been diluted to the point of meaning almost nothing. And I want to encourage that, because it is used falsely 90% of the time. So I encourage people to say that if you don't like the weather, say the weather's racist. If your IPA has too many hops in it, say the beer is racist. And if people ask you why, well, say, you know, what, are you going to be easy on racism? I encourage, in other words, since we're being subject to an intolerant, false, ridiculous new religion, we should blaspheme its false gods as Elijah did the idols of Baal. And we should treat the new woke cult with scorn. And if Yale dares to take away our hard-won expensive degrees, we should mount a class action suit so crippling that they have to raffle off those buildings to the Knights of Columbus to pay the settlement. If they try to take our degrees away, we should try to get their endowments seized by the government, get them de-accredited. We should declare war on any institution that tries to fraudulently strip us of our own attainments in violation of countless centuries of contract law, in order to turn the school retroactively into an atheist woke seminary. That is a declaration of war. And I'm willing to work with any populist politician, left or right, to destroy the privileges of the new, intolerant, insufferable oligarchy that is increasingly turning the screws on this country and imposing on us a religion without God, a totalitarianism without a utopia, and essentially a two-tiered standard of justice. When the Democrats launched riots all across America, burning down blue-collar and black neighborhoods, wrecking billions of dollars in property, those were peaceful protests. When a couple of numbnut, lugnut idiots at the Capitol take selfies next to statues and maybe break a window or two, oh, that's Kristallnacht. That's the Reichstag fire. We have to repeal the Constitution. We have to expel people from the Senate. We have to make it impossible to ever talk about voter fraud again, because it might make someone who believes in QAnon go take a selfie at the Capitol. And that is the worst thing that ever happened in the history of this country. Meanwhile, our president is cozying up to the slave-owning Communist Party of China, and almost 1 million unborn children are aborted every year. For God, for country, and for Yale, yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, John. Well said and much appreciated. Bobby, over to you.
Thank you so much. This is such an honor to be up with such writers that I admire so much. I'm just going to start by going back to April of 1991, 30 years ago. I remember one Saturday night, I was in Phelps Hall, which is a building on Old Campus that houses the classics department. And on that particular night, I had no awareness that one day I would actually be a classic scholar, that I would study Greek and Latin and do scholarship on the Bible. All I knew was that I was a leftist. I was a left-wing student back then. I was an activist. I knew that I was an ethnic minority, so I knew that to be wholesome and true, I had to be some kind of radical activist. And the reason why I was in Phelps Hall that night was because I had reserved several rooms for the launch of this Filipino intercollegiate network. I was the president of the Filipino students group there, which I had founded in 1989. And as the leader of that group, I had communicated with 300 colleges up and down the Eastern Seaboard, and I had traveled to New York City, to Rhode Island, to South Hadley, to Boston, to upstate New York, to Baltimore, to create all these networks, to have meetings with people, to found this organization. And this organization still exists now. This was that's what was so exhilarating about that moment, was you really felt like you were building something that was going to last. So I had reserved these rooms in Phelps Hall, and then I remember this old classics professor came down and he told me, "Get out." And I said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "You and everyone get out of here. We're doing important work." And I said, "Well, this is important history work. I'm a student." And he just said, "No, get out. You're making too much noise." And I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want the police to get involved. So I brought everybody to Lindsley Chittenden Hall, and we had our meeting in this other big conference hall. And as I stood up there, I felt so excited because I had gone on this quest of ethnic activism, partly because I grew up without my dad there. My mom was Puerto Rican, and I had been cut off from Filipino culture. And so what was so important to me at this time was to build a relationship to the culture that I had lost, that I felt had been deprived from me. And I wanted to be able to provide that to other people. And so it was a great night. It was exciting. And then 10 years later, I went to the website about that organization, and they had a whole section on the history of it. And I had been erased. I was gone from that history. They said that the organization was founded at Harvard a year later, rather than at Yale when it was founded. And it made me go back and reflect upon what happened when I was a leftist, and why was it that I had been erased, at least from that organization. And I realized that back then, even though I was what John would call woke, even though I was on the left wing, I had a life that made people uncomfortable. And these were people who had a political ideology that didn't have room for who I was. I had grown up in a home with a mother who was in a same-sex relationship with another woman in the 70s and 80s. And this was incredibly rare back then. And back then, this was something that made the gay community uncomfortable, because it made them have to think about people who had gotten married and had kids in the closet and were, it was an uncomfortable issue. And obviously, it was a struggle for me. And I didn't have a good experience growing up in the gay community. I had been sexually abused. I had a lot of trauma left over from that. And so even when I was at Yale, I was a nervous person. I was neurotic. I didn't know how to socialize with people. Nobody would help you deal with those kinds of traumas. I had come out as gay, and that was actually kind of scandalous in 1991, even in the left-wing ethnic organizations, because the Filipino Americans were worried, what are the elders going to think? And so I remember now, the night of that conference, there was a distance. People were already trying to say, wow, it's so great that he did all this work to build this organization, but he's not what we need. He's not what we need going forward. We don't want his story. It makes us uncomfortable. So I was canceled basically back then for being too radical, too scandalous. And then I look back at that now from the perspective of 2021. I spent 20 years teaching in the academy. I ended up realizing that I wasn't gay, that that whole ideology didn't really suit who I was. I've been married to a woman for 20 years. I'm happy. But I find that even now as an adult in my 50s, if I write about or speak about what happened, if I just tell the truth, my story makes people uncomfortable. And it makes it so that the questions that my experience poses to people are questions that they can't answer. And the questions that they want to pose, I have answers to, but they're not the answers that they're looking for. And the instinct back then and now is to erase. And so the thing that is sad, when I see a petition from Harvard saying that they're going to take away people's degrees, I don't take that lightly. From what I've seen over the last 30 years, I believe that something along those lines will actually be taken seriously and may come to pass, because I've already been erased by Yale. I know what that's like because of the experience that I had. And what's the most tragic thing is that even if you are leftist, you will get erased, because everything that I did was taking seriously what what left-wing ideology presented itself as. I was trying to work to build a structure that would empower an ethnic community that was a minority in the United States. But unfortunately, their contradictions don't allow for challenges. They can't handle ambiguity. And so even though I went on from that experience and I wrote many books and I became fluent in many languages and I taught thousands of students, I am now listed by GLAAD, by the Human Rights Campaign, by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-gay bigot. And the cost that has been to me has been tremendous. And I think that when people talk about tearing down statues, taking names off of buildings, going back and purging the history books, refusing to let people even be acknowledged for the contributions that they did provide to people. You have to understand that when you do that, you erase knowledge, and you take a great institution like Yale, which was supposed to be a place of inquiry and vibrant discussion and intellectual development, and you turn it into the Inquisition, but just without God. You turn it into a sterile, oppressive institution that doesn't do anything. It's not making people smarter. It's not making people better leaders or better citizens. And the saddest thing is that all of the people who work so hard to get into an institution like that, who made all of those sacrifices and all of those contributions, they have to live with the fear that can all be taken away if at any moment they express a political affiliation that offends the institution. And that I'll leave it at that, that it's a very real danger to start talking about erasing people, even from the accomplishments that they had. And I'd like to leave it over to Declan now to deal with the discussion time, but I want to thank folks for having joined the discussion and giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Bobby. Well said. And just as a brief reminder to everyone watching, feel free to write in via message or to the comment section if you have any questions or points you would like our guests to address. We'll be more than happy to ask those questions in a few minutes. In this next section of the conversation, we'll be turning it back over to our guests for some brief additional remarks on the topics that the other presenters have addressed. So, Eric, I'll turn it over to you if you have some additional thoughts.
Well, first of all, I want to say that we're talking about a lot of things here, but I think, we've all known in our lifetimes that Yale leans left. Buckley, in his book, God and Man at Yale, is talking about the Yale of the 40s. And in the 40s, he's basically saying that the faculty are, atheists and communists, and I can prove it, and here it is. Yale has tended in that direction. It's been slow, but we finally arrived at this point of maximum absurdity where you feel like you're dealing with young Maoists who, if you look the wrong way or you don't do something exactly the way you should, you'll pay a huge price. We have to, I think sometimes things get so bad that finally you see what is happening. And I kind of think we are there today. You have to have principles, and Yale, let's be honest, they ceased to have principles a long time ago. They're just figuring out as they go along. But the idea that we really believe in something, that we're going to stand up for people's different points of view, that was not there when I was there in the early 80s. And I do think that we have to understand that if you do not have transcendent values, eventually this is what happens. I was thinking, it's kind of funny because I wanted to say it again, that my book, Fish Out of Water, has itself been subject to, I don't know if you want to call it cancel culture, but it seems clear to me that Amazon is shadow banning my book, Fish Out of Water. Why do I say that? Because typically when a book like that comes out, they heavily discount it up front and it sells. It seems that with conservative books or books by conservatives or books with conservative publishers, that they don't do that. They just decide to, in a sense, behave toward it as something that they don't like. With my friend Ryan Anderson's book recently, When Harry Became Sally, they just decided they're going to get rid of the book. This is something that's happening in our culture, but when it happens at a place like Yale, where you spend a lot of money and a great amount of effort to get a degree, you really have to wonder, because this is, to me, when I was at Yale, the president was Bartlett Giamatti, and Bart was, after this, he became the commissioner of baseball. And many people will remember he was the one to go toe-to-toe with Pete Rose about the gambling and so on and so forth. And it's an interesting thing, because it's one thing to say we're not going to let you into the Hall of Fame because we've had these long-standing rules. You knew about it always. We didn't change the rules, and you can't get into the Hall of Fame. It seems harsh to me after all this time, and it seems like we should have grace. But imagine if they'd said to Pete Rose, you no longer exist as a baseball player. We have the right now to take your numbers and throw them in the garbage. We're going to burn the box scores of the games you were in. You will no longer exist. That's kind of what we're talking about here. When you talk about cancel culture, it's not that we all knew the rules and somebody broke the rules and then we can decide, is it too harsh to do this or not? We're talking about rules that are invented as we go along. Places like Yale, all they can do is go with the flow. They kind of look around to figure out, what do we do now? What do we do now? And it really is, it's a classic case of not having any transcendent values or principles. And you basically say, we will do whatever works right now. Right now, everybody's out for blood. So we will think about canceling this or that because we don't want someone to cancel us. We don't want to lose brand share. Yale is worth so and so much money. We want it to stay where it is. And we're willing to do whatever the culture demands of us. It really would be as though somebody said, not only is Pete Rose not going to get in the Hall of Fame, but we are going to wash baseball clean of Pete Rose. He never was a member of Major League Baseball. This is the kind of stuff that is just, it's crazy. We need to talk about it, and we're talking about it.
Thank you, Eric. I certainly agree with that. John, do you have any additional comments?
Sure. I'd like people to think, how would it be received if Catholic colleges revoked the degree of any graduate who came out as pro-choice? How would it look if Yeshiva University rescinded the degree of any graduate who married outside the Jewish faith? What would people think about that? Imagine if historically Black colleges started revoking degrees of someone who married someone of another race. I think that shows up the absolute consummate absurdity of what's being discussed here. There should be literally nothing you can do to lose your college degree, except if they find that you cheated on your tests or someone ghost wrote your senior thesis. So the pretense of due process, the pretense of a non-double standard society is important to avoid civil war. And the left has been pushing past even the slightest hypocrisy, tearing off the last fig leaf of fairness. And then it's surprised that people are talking about civil war and that people are engaging in what they call insurrections in our nation's sacred Capitol building. I'd like to give a little intellectual background here that I think people would find useful. There's a great book by George Marsden called The Heart and Soul of the American University. And it explains how schools like Harvard and Yale went from being broadly and deeply Christian to being first vaguely and jadedly Christian to rudderless secular, and now to intolerant Puritan seminaries of the false woke religion. And he says the social gospel is what did it. When Darwin published, and a lot of biblically based Protestants began to feel like Darwin cast doubt on the reliability of Scripture, the idea arose in some elite circles, let's just preach Christian ethics and let's apply them to society. Let's help the poor. Let's resolve international conflicts. Let's create the League of Nations. Let's break up the Habsburg Empire into little ethno-states. Let's help women be equal to men. Let's attack racism. Now, many of these are all good things. Many of these are good things in themselves, but they became the Christian religion. So soup kitchens replaced any kind of religious education. Nobody talked about Easter. They talked about the revival of urban ghettos. They talked about raising countries like Czechoslovakia from the dead. Woodrow Wilson actually was the apotheosis of this. As president of the United States, he believed and told people at the Versailles Conference that he was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit, because the United States was the country that would bring progressivism to the whole world, and that the New Jerusalem would be achieved through American military intervention in World War I. This is the kind of half-baked madness that took over the chapels and the chaplaincies of these elite schools. And that's how you go from Duke University being a seriously Christian college in the 1950s, it's a liberal arts school is still called the Trinity School, to them being aggressive, woke, puritanical, evangelical, inquisitorial academies of a new religious orthodoxy, because man can't live without some kind of orthodoxy. The idea of being a blasé epicure, just savoring all the flowers from the different civilizations of the world and wandering from idea to idea, philosophy to philosophy, that is the humanist ideal that was sold to these schools as their religious faith ebbed away. But that's inherently so unstable. That's not going to last. We are a religious animal. Man is a religious animal. And if you don't give him the true religion, he's going to find a false one. As you see, all the secularism in Europe didn't lead to happy, blasé, liberal, libertarian utopias. It gave way to communism and Nazism and fascism. That's because man craves certainties. He also craves freedom of discussion. After the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the West kind of hit a happy balance where there are orthodoxies, but the government's not going to persecute you for failing to adhere to one. We seem to be getting past that moment. We seem to be getting to a moment of a new, suffocating, internally incoherent orthodoxy of Christian ethics based on a nihilist, mechanistic Darwinian foundation. Talk about a statue with feet of clay.
If I could, before we go to questions, because I think people are writing in the chat, but I just wanted to say that what I notice about this, false religion, wokeness, whatever you want to call it, is that there's no grace, there's no love, there's just no grace, there's no forgiveness. In fact, it's the precise antithesis of grace. You can go back and find any sin that anyone has committed, and it is equally vile this minute as though it had been committed this minute, I should say, if it happened 40 years ago, or even if the rules have changed. That's bizarre, and it's the antithesis of the Christian idea of forgiveness, where you can make a mistake and people say, you know what, we all make mistakes. How can we get past this? Do you understand that you made a mistake? Are you sorry? Maybe you can do something about it, but we don't want to beat you over the head with this, especially if you have tried to deal with it, if you've said, yes, I made a mistake. This is really about, the accuser of the brethren, to use a New Testament quote, to perpetually shame people, to crush people with their own mistakes or sins, including invented mistakes and invented sins. It's utterly graceless. It is ultimately evil and anti-human. And places like Yale, you would think, would be doing something to actually think about this. In other words, even in this conversation, we're having an open conversation. Yale is supposed to be the kind of place where you have these kinds of conversations, where you try to look at things from a broader perspective and say, what is going on here? What are the parallels in history? How did it go when people took this tack in history? Did it go well? We know, those of us here, that it went extremely poorly, that the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge and the Gulag in the Soviet Union, that is the end of this kind of thinking. And what has made the West great, what has made America great, is that we have been able to talk about this, and we have been able to avoid some of these things because we have had transcendent values, the most basic of which is open discussion and genuine tolerance for other ideas, not fake PC tolerance, but tolerance of conservatives, tolerance of biblical views if you're not yourself a Christian or a Jew. That's, to me, at the heart of it.
Thank you very much, Eric. Turning now to some questions that people have written into the chat. And again, if you have questions that you'd like to have addressed, please write in and we'll happily address them on the air. The first question comes from Andrea, and it is, what is it to actually cancel a diploma? What are the mechanics? How can a school actually do that, and what might it look like?
Can I answer that?
Please, yes.
Okay. I think it's essentially preposterous. In other words, when you get to be somebody like me or John or Bobby, if somebody were to cancel my diploma from Yale, I would laugh. In other words, the very act of doing that shows that they don't even have the authority to do that. There's no reason for them to do it. So it becomes ridiculous. But obviously we see this kind of thing. Abigail Schreier was mentioned. Ryan Anderson was mentioned. People are taking actions to hurt people, doing whatever they can. So it seems to me that this is the kind of thing that hurts some people more than others. But it seems, on the face of it, preposterous. It's the kind of thing some crazy woke students would dream up, and they would circulate a petition. But at least it's gotten us talking.
Well, I can tell you about something parallel. I just learned today that there's a database created where you can report your neighbors or acquaintances or family members who you think voted for Donald Trump. And then this database will make that public in as many forums as possible, according to the website, so that the authorities can take appropriate action against these advocates of violent insurrection.
And who are the authorities? Here's the question, right?
The authorities are Facebook and Google and Twitter and the Ivy League. They're all part of the same hive. They're part of the same oligarchy that wants to take complete control of the media, of the political process, of all education, to eliminate freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Each of these fundamental constitutional values is being eroded and being attacked, being waved off as slaveholder privileges, fruits of whiteness, whatever emotive, rationally implausible slogan they can repeat to gain the other members of the hive. When leftists talk, I see it as bees doing their little dances, driven by pheromones, telling the other bees where to fly. Rationality doesn't play any role in it anymore. It's simply insect behavior, hive insect behavior.
Yeah, regarding Andrea Smith's question, I do want to say that I have had experience, for instance, when I finished my graduate program, my PhD, and I went on the job market, there usually is a central office of records, a registrar's office that works with the placement office at your college. And they would keep, for instance, your recommendation letters in that file. They would have your transcript, and they could also potentially affix to it other records to it. And I went through that when I went on the job market. And also when you transfer from job to job, your personnel file has all kinds of things in it. It's very hard sometimes to get your personnel file to see what they are sending out. And so I have had experience with people going back to previous places you worked or your current workplace or places where you studied, and they put pressure on people not to give you recommendation letters. They might put pressure on people in the registrar's office not to release your transcripts. They may engage in kind of sabotage that isn't direct. They're not going to say we're doing this, but they'll come up with some crazy bureaucratic reason that they can't release your transcript. And I have actually had experiences like that. I don't know if John and Eric have, but I mean, the activists that came after me, they were not at all restrained about contacting institutions that have my records and trying to actually torture me in this way where, like, just to be able to move on with my life, you can't get your records released. So I have no doubt that this petition at Harvard will eventually lead to some kind of movement like that, even if it's not some official thing from the administrations saying we're going to rescind your degree. I think the most disturbing thing is that I haven't seen Harvard or Yale come out and say, we totally reject this movement to try to do it. That's what really scares me.
Look at what other things the left is doing. Other things the left is doing, like MasterCard was pressured not to accept donations for the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which is a completely mainstream conservative place that advocates for peace in the Middle East and security for the state of Israel. The moment the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a boondoggle money printing scam, the moment they put the extremist or hate monger label on a group, it has to run around telling people, no, we're not pedophiles. We're not murderers. We don't club baby seals. You have to run around the world trying to undo the damage, the slander that these irresponsible, self-appointed watchdogs of orthodoxy have done to you. I've seen things about putting Trump supporters on no-fly lists. You had one MSNBC journalist was talking about, well, domestic extremists maybe should be subject to the same kind of things as Obama used against American citizens who belong to Al-Qaeda, drone strikes. You've got people on mainstream media networks talking about drone strikes against Trump supporters. It sounds like absolute madness, but did you live through 2020? I did too. It felt like you were in a bad apocalyptic novel that had been typed single space in a double wide trailer and sold exclusively at gun shows in the 90s. We're living through it.
And two other previous examples, when Amy Coney Barrett was under the spotlight, members of her sorority from her undergraduate years were writing to Rhodes College, trying to get Rhodes College to issue some kind of denunciation of her. And then Judge Kavanaugh, when he was under the spotlight, remember that he was an alumnus of Yale. That was his undergraduate campus. And I think, Declan, you were on campus when that happened. The law school, the Yale Law School, canceled classes. They officially made that decision to allow Yale students to take buses to go protest Kavanaugh. So there are a lot of ways that this could look like, even if it's not Pete Salovey coming out tomorrow saying, I'm going to cancel, I'm going to take away your degrees, because that really would be a meaningless thing. I think the more dangerous thing is all these intermediate, getting you banned from alumni networks, getting you having some website where they list the fact that you're an alumni of that school, and then also having all this negative commentary underneath that you can't get rid of. It follows you everywhere on the net.
That's right.
I think we have to use the time we have here to challenge Yale and to ask them, do you stand for anything? If you actually stand for diversity, will you stand for diversity of thought? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, all of these institutions, which are ostensibly worth billions, they have died. They no longer have any life in them. I know that there are innumerable people who would never dream of sending their kids to a place like Yale because they've seen what it has become. And if Yale does not take action to do something about this almost immediately, they're over. I mean, they're almost over already. But I just wonder, having this conversation, if we could challenge them to say, what are your standards? Should anybody who spends a dime on tuition next year, 5 years from now, should they worry that that money is being burned because their kid might say something and you'll take away that that diploma? So people who would apply to a place like Yale today better think twice. Do you really want to risk spending that kind of money when the atmosphere today is such that you could be throwing your money away? The Yale diploma won't be worth the paper that it's printed on because we don't know what kind of maniacs have taken control of the institution. Yale needs to think about that there are people that are going to vote with their feet and they're going to say, I can't risk it. If they look into this or this or this, that diploma will be worth nothing. Why would I send my kid there? I'll send my kid to Liberty. I'll send my kid to Hillsdale. I'm certainly not going to send them to Yale. And by the way, everyone sort of knows that Yale is on the crazy train. They are no longer willing to stand up to anything right now. In other words, it wouldn't take a huge amount of courage to stand up and say, we're for free speech. We're for actual diversity of thought. This is like the most basic thing. They're unwilling to do that. Until they're willing to do that, they're going to lose everything. I mean, they're losing it now as we have this conversation, which certainly won't stop.
Is a Yale diploma or a Harvard diploma going to be transformed into a revocable license from the hive to work, to buy and sell in the marketplace? And it can be revoked at any time if your behavior doesn't meet the standards of orthodoxy. If people don't find that chilling, then it means when they read 1984 or Brave New World, they were confused. They thought it was an instruction manual, not a dystopian satire. They need to go back and reread it with a different set of glasses. By the way, someone asked what was the book I was talking about. Yes. It's The Heart and Soul of the American University by George Marsden, Marsden. Wonderful.
Marsden taught at Yale.
Oh, right.
Thank you very much. One question from Burton is, where is the Republican Party on due process? Where is the Republican Party on these issues of cancellation? We saw the Kavanaugh nomination have some serious due process questions, to say the least, but where is the party on this issue?
Crouched under the couch, terrified. I think the Republican Party should be trying to defund these universities. Cut federal funding except for science, technology, engineering, and math. If they had any guts, they would already be doing that. The Republican Party is despicable. Mitch McConnell and company, I don't know what they are. They're career politicians. They don't deserve to be where they are. Shame on all of them for not doing anything that might cost them some of their precious political capital. They don't want their wives getting the stink eye at the country club, and they're willing to sell out the country for the sake of that.
Correct.
One more question is on the incident at Smith College. For those who are not familiar, there was an article in the New York Times today that details a number of events at Smith College, one of which was the so-called dining while black incident, where a student claimed to have been harassed by campus security for eating in a dorm, and it later came out that the dorm was closed and under renovation. And then, in addition, more recently, a woman left Smith College due to the racial sensitivity training that she was subjugated to, saying, very much in line of sort of intersectional critical race theory. And so, do you have any comments on the Smith College incident or series of incidents?
I can speak to it, and this kind of combines with some of what they were asking about the Republican Party. I work with a group here in Texas, and we just are trying to push our legislative priorities in Austin. We go there, we lobby. It's an uphill battle, but we are trying. And one of the things we're trying to get Republicans to understand is that in most states, there are pre-existing laws on workplace harassment. And so we believe that many of these training programs that schools and offices put their constituents through qualify as workplace harassment. A lot of times this is unwelcome discussion of a sexual nature that is not necessary or germane to the mission of that organization, and it makes people uncomfortable. And that right there is the definition of workplace harassment. So I think that Smith College, that woman was very brave in getting out of there. I think we need to have legislation on this. What has happened in the past when I've gone to DC and tried to talk to people at the Department of Education, and it didn't matter. It was when Obama was president. It was under Trump as well. It was the same thing. People in the Department of Education, both left and right, they would say, we don't want to get involved. We can't interfere with what schools are doing with their employees or with their students. And that kind of small government philosophy is not what we need right now. We actually need somebody to do this. Universities are tax-exempt nonprofit organizations. I think their tax exemption should be on the table. I think their accreditation should be on the table. I think their eligibility for grants and underwriting of student loans, all of that should be on the table. If they put students or employees or faculty through harassment or intimidation or any kind of practice that under any other guideline would qualify as workplace harassment, I think that the government needs to have the mechanism to take action and to correct.
That's right. Let's use their stupid micromanaging regulations against them. I helped a student at LSU who being failed in a class. She got a grade of 0 on a paper and it was apparently because she cited Thomas Aquinas and she was using Thomistic categories in an analysis of a novel, and the professor was a Marxist atheist. I wrote the brief, and I'm not even a lawyer, turning this into harassment, and effectively came under sexual harassment law. And the university folded like a cheap tent and reversed the grade to an A and backed away as if they were a pile of plutonium. Turn their weapons against them. But remember, institutions like Yale and Harvard have declared war on us. They are our enemies, and it is time to start treating them that way and go against them by any means necessary, to quote Malcolm X. These are not neutral institutions, much less friendly ones. They are the new face of an oligarchy that wants to completely stifle our freedom and make our children slaves.
You mean that in a good way, I take it, John?
Well, Yale is still named after a slave trader. I'd love to point that out. They should rename Yale. I don't know, call it Lesbian University or something. Find something acceptable. Maybe call it Caitlyn Jenner College. I don't know, but it's for a college named after a slave owner. It's mighty rich that they're putting on these airs.
But that's what's so funny is that they have this brand. It's worth billions and billions. And I think it's interesting that at some point they have to understand there is a price to pay if you move in the direction. There hasn't been a price to pay for moving in the direction in which you've been moving for, practically 100 years. But I think that now with the internet, with people's ability to communicate, you have to think what I was saying earlier, that people are going to think twice about sending their children to a place like this, because they're thinking there are no guarantees. Not only will my child probably be brainwashed, that's something that becomes clear and clear every month that passes, but I don't even know if I can guarantee that the diploma that they earn will be theirs. There are absolutely, there are utterly subjective standards. There are the whims of certain people are being brought to bear on this kind of stuff. What guarantees can they give me? Will they be willing to give guarantees? If places like Yale don't face this and don't put out a statement or something like that, spending the kind of money, spending $200,000 for a degree, you're certainly going to think twice about it, especially now with the possibilities that are open to people that weren't open to people even 10 years ago.
Thank you, Eric. So we have 2 questions in the chat from Ellie. The first of which goes directly to Bobby, and it was to get a little more information on the activist that interfered with your job search. And then the second question is a little bit broader, and it's asking how, with complicit media and the mainstream media sort of playing defense for certain ideologies, How do we confront these key questions, and how do we confront the universities with a media that is biased against certain viewpoints?
Okay, I think the person wrote in, thank you very much for that question. They wanted to know whether the activists were actually employed at the institutions that I had gone to school at and worked at. The honest to God answer was that it may have been that at some point, but I do know that people off campus recruited people on those various campuses to try to create these internal complaints or internal pressure on the campus. So what they do, let's say that you are on the job market and you went to Yale. What the activists will do is they'll look you up on LinkedIn. They'll track down every part of your life. They'll try to figure out who they know at Yale, and they'll get in contact with people there, and then they'll start threatening or intimidating people there. They will bombard them with emails that say, look, this person who's tied to your organization said this and this and that. They'll send lots of quotes out of context, and then they'll have some kind of demand, like they want you to refuse to allow that person to use the facilities to have guest speakers, take away their grants, take away their sabbaticals, disqualify them from promotion. They want to find out who's going to be on your promotion review committee. And in many cases, they can try to find out who has the power to be able to put negative comments in your personnel file or in your academic record file. This is really scary stuff, but this is happening. And this isn't even recent. I remember this was going on as far back as 2012, 2013, when I first published my first thing on that. So some of them were employees on the campus who were actively doing it, but a lot of them had been recruited by people off campus.
So that's why I call it a hive, because people they're coordinated. They don't think these things through. They're not arguing about these issues. They're getting little pheromone signals and flying in a certain direction and swarming and stinging. The way that, one of my good friends is Mark Judge, drive-by victim of Christine Blasey Ford's perjury designed to keep someone off the Supreme Court. It was exposed that she worked for a company that produces the abortion pill, still works for a company that produces the abortion pill. No one would report this anywhere in the media, including Fox. So you've got a woman, it's potentially a pivotal vote on the Supreme Court for Roe v. Wade. This woman works for the abortion industry. Nobody would talk about that, but they would broadcast her utterly unprovable, baseless, transparently false, it seems, perjured charges on this floor of the U.S. Senate and every possible medium. And my friend Mark Judge got accused of being a teenage gang rapist on NBC News. None of it matters. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is political victory. They will destroy Mark Judge. They were willing to destroy Brett Kavanaugh simply because they did the math on the Supreme Court votes. This is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with totalitarians who are willing to use totalitarian methods. What people are doing, the way the left is acting today, has historical precedents. I think the closest one is Spain in 1936, when the left was shooting members of parliament who didn't support them, beating people up in the street, burning churches. All I have to say is, if you give us Spain 1936, we'll give you Spain 1939. It won't be pretty, but you're not going to prevail over a country that is still, in many areas, doggedly Christian, with 65 or 75 million private firearms. The left is playing a very dangerous game.
Yeah, and also remember that all of these universities have a Title IX office, and the Title IX officer, under the guidelines that first started under Obama, they can open an investigation with no due process, no protections for the accused whatsoever, and they can open an investigation after you've already left the institution. So if I worked at the University of Alaska, now it's 10 years later, I'm working somewhere else, someone could make an accusation that I did something there, and that office would have to investigate. And if I decide not to participate in it, then they draw the conclusion without me having any part of it. And then it gets into your record at some point. So, you are talking about a very Kafkaesque system. I think the other question was posed to Eric, wasn't it, about the media?
I wasn't clear what the question was. I couldn't read the whole question on my screen.
Yes, Eric, I think the question was essentially, how do we operate in a media environment where the media is so biased against certain ideas? You talked earlier about confronting Yale about the challenges of cancel culture and asking them what they stand for. Well, how do you do that if the media outlets simply ignore the problem in the first place and then are actively hostile to presenting viewpoints in that direction?
Well, listen, we all have the benefit of living in the world called reality. And in reality, you can get away with stuff for a season, but then eventually the truth will out, to quote Shakespeare. You cannot suppress the truth forever. And the free market similarly will ultimately correct itself if people are willing to do something about it. So when you talk about the media, just as Yale is losing market share by day, the media is losing market share. Twitter and Facebook are losing market share. They're all going to die unless they do something. In other words, you can play the game for a while, but eventually, the chickens are going to come home to roost. So if you play this game long enough, eventually, Twitter, people say, you see how they treated so and 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 so. I'm out. Goodbye, Twitter. I'm going to try something else, or I'm just bored. I don't want to do this stuff anymore. This is happening. It's going to happen. It's happening to CNN. It's happening to every single one of the media outlets. So we can complain that we're at a high watermark for censorship. I mean, what happened with the election, what happened with January 6th, all of these things are grotesque. They're horrifying. But in a free country, enough people can still see what's happening and make their private decisions based on what they've observed. And I think that those 80 million Americans who are pro-Trump are privately disgusted, and they may not be able to do anything about it publicly, but they're filing it away. And they're saying, I see how those people acted when they had power. I see what's going on. I was blind. I didn't know. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have thought, oh, well, that's the way things work. Now I have seen things that I've never seen before. And I really do think when we talk about the media, I mean, even our having this conversation now, it wasn't really possible a few years ago. The reality is constantly changing. And if you play this game, there's a price to be paid. And when you have the truth on your side, and all of us here are simply arguing for the truth, in the end, you will win. How you win, the details of the victory, I don't know. But if you are gaming the system, eventually the law will catch up with you. And when I say the law, I mean the law of averages. The fact is that you can't do this forever. The Soviet Union lasted, 70 years. They had, unlimited power over their people, but it doesn't work. We understand what works. We understand what doesn't work. And they're playing a very dangerous game. So I think that many of them are now having these conversations at Fox News and at CNN. They're wondering that, they rode this wave and they made some profit out of it. What's it going to get them in the long run? If people don't ever trust them again, if people are finding utterly alternate means of media, that is happening every single day.
My main news source is now the Epoch Times, a small newspaper founded in New York by Falun Gong activists who were anti-Chinese communists. And now it's become enormous because it's willing to tell the truth about the election. Newsmax has become enormous at Fox News' expense. Real America's Voice, One America News. That's why the left is so desperate to crush them. Parler was about to eat the lunch of Twitter, so they got Amazon to take away its servers. They're trying now to get Newsmax taken off cable networks. They're desperate to destroy the competition. The free market isn't free anymore because it's now a crony capitalist prostitute marriage of big government, big media, big tech, and big ideology. And we have to fight it as hard as we can. Boycott, protest. If we ever have an honest election again, and I'm dubious about that, and ever elect a Republican president again, if that is permitted, I'm not sure it will be, we have to completely throw away this small government nonsense and use the government to destroy these institutions. Antitrust actions, break up Google, break up Facebook, break up Twitter, break them up into 50 pieces to be governed by the states, the way they broke up the phone company. I'll tell you what, Ma Bell didn't listen in on your phone calls. And if it didn't like what you say, hang up your phone and cancel your phone service. The current tech monopolies are infinitely more dangerous than the oil barons, the robber barons, or the phone company. It is profound, the threat that this poses to American freedom and democracy.
Absolutely. One more question that just came in the chat is asking if there are many universities that are not toxic now.
7 or 8. We could name them, and right off the top of my head, I used to edit for 10 years the Choosing the Right College, the guide for conservative and religious parents, and where you should send your kids. We stopped publishing it in part because there were too few options we could recommend. I would say there are places like Hillsdale, there are places like the King's College, places like Grove City. But what I basically tell parents is find the cheapest, closest state university where your kid can live at home for all 4 years, because that campus culture is much more poisonous than anything that's going on in the classrooms. Your kid's probably not doing the reading. He's probably not listening to the professors, but he's listening to the people in his dorm, hooking up with the people in his dorm, doing drugs with the people in his dorm, and being pressured and brainwashed by the atmosphere around him. So I recommend people send their kids to the cheapest state university they can. Tell them, don't take seriously anything they tell you that conflicts with what you learned in church. Treat college like a colonoscopy. You want it over with as quickly and as painlessly as possible.
I just think it's wrong that we don't have a live audience to applaud John's brilliant lines. On my radio show, I just howl when John talks because it's brilliant, and it's funny. It's all three. But I do think John is exactly right. I think that we have wildly overrated college, and especially places like Yale. I mean, the idea that we say, oh, if you go there, you've got it made. You have nothing made. You now literally don't even know if you get to keep your diploma. After working hard to get in, after working hard to get the diploma, after paying all that money, you now no longer, things have gotten so crazy that nothing is guaranteed. So I completely agree with John. And frankly, I want to say this as well. College itself is overrated. And the idea that you've got to go to college and get a degree, you've got to go to many of the most successful people I know did not do that. They got some great job at age 18 or 19. They're entrepreneurs. They're brilliant. They saved themselves and their parents a lot of trouble, and they benefited tremendously. So I simply think the day is done, that something happened where, it's kind of this false egalitarian idea that everybody can go to college, everybody has to go to college. And what are most people doing in college? I don't know. It's very expensive. So I think that there is a reset going on, but it's not the reset that, the global elites want to be happening. There's a reset. People are watching what is going on. They're watching the madness. They're watching the woke hysteria, and they're privately making notes that they're going to do this and do that. They don't need to go on the news and talk about it. They're just going to do it. I really think that college is just one of the things that after COVID, after all this, I think tons of people are thinking differently about what all that means.
Thank you, Eric. It looks like we have one more question asking about whether the harassment and the toxicity is centralized in organizations like the SPLC, or has it diffused into sort of the broader body politic?
I would say both. Definitely, in my experience, you have, and the problem is because of this big tech world where the internet companies, like the Google and Twitter, etc., they allow a small number of people to project this reality into so many people's brains. You do have groups like Southern Poverty Law Center or the Commentator Accountability Project at GLAAD, where you had a paid person. I remember Jeremy Hooper was a person who, if I'm not mistaken, this is what he did. He was hired to run the Commentator Accountability Project at GLAAD. So what he would do is he would go track down comments that could be quoted and listed on a website. And it used to be that whenever anybody shared one of the articles that I wrote on Facebook, that page of all of these negative quotes attributed to me would come up because they had actually bought some kind of ad placement program with Facebook. So it is organized, but at a certain level, it becomes diffused because it's like you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It's gotten out there. This is what people believe. I have to accept the fact that there are many, many people who believe about me what they see on these websites, like the Southern Poverty Law Center page, and they don't believe, me. Even I have to admit, I don't want to start a family feud, but there are people in my family, very close, I grew up with, that I love very dearly, who they got angry with me based on what activists forwarded to them, saying that I had said, rather than what I had actually said, because they didn't want to read the actual articles because they were just so afraid of looking at it. They didn't want to look at it. So it is really hard to say whether it's all the fault of these centralized organized processes or whether it's the culture. I would say both.
Thank you very much, Bobby. So it looks like that's all the questions we have. In concluding, I'll turn back to the panelists for brief concluding remarks. Eric, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Well, there a lot's been said here. One thing that John and I have talked about on my radio program, by the way, I don't know if we mentioned that. I have a radio program, and it's usually on YouTube and on Rumble, but Eric Metaxas show. But one thing that we've talked about is how each of us has tremendous power at this point. We are not yet in Germany in 1943. We have power. One of the things we have is the power of the purse. We have a lot of money. Americans spend a lot of money. How you spend your money is still up to you. And if you want to give your money to an institution like Yale before they are willing to come out and address this, what we're talking about tonight, many people are going to think, I'm just not willing to do that. If things are this crazy now, how will they be 4 years from now? And so I want to say to, my fellow Americans in particular, you have tremendous power. The stores that you shop in, online where you shop. I mean, we were talking earlier, John was talking about Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps today, now in China, doing things it's slave labor. Now, we have to think of this as a human rights issue. If you knew that you're paying a company and that they're giving you a product, and somebody says, they use Jews in Treblinka are making some of those products. Did you know that? Now, if that's how you want to spend your money, God is going to judge you for that. You need to think about how you spend your money. And so when somebody is part of the cancel culture, all of these stores that are coming after Mike Lindell, you don't have to agree with Mike Lindell, but if you shop in stores like Kohl's and Bed Bath & Beyond that have absolutely labeled themselves as cowards, willing to go after anyone, willing to throw anyone under the bus as long as they can save their hide, I think Americans are thinking twice and need to think twice. Do I ever want to shop in a Kohl's? Do I ever want to shop in a Bed Bath & Beyond? I'm going to write them an email. It's very easy. I'm going to go to their website and I'm going to tell them why I and everyone I can communicate with will never shop there again, because we cannot abide our money going to a company that has no values, that is willing to do anything for the bottom line. Nike, unless you're willing to look into the slave labor situation and come out with a statement and say, we will never participate in this, we will never buy Nike shoes. Now, if people aren't willing to do that, these are very small sacrifices. But if people aren't willing to do that, they deserve what they can get. But I'm here to say, I think there are plenty of people who understand you have tremendous power. Where you spend your dollars will affect people. People will not, the people in the corporations that are taking that money, they will really think twice, since they have no values, evidently. They will think twice if they see the bottom line threatened by folks like us who go out there and say, we will not stand for this. What you did there, we're going to, online, we're going to tell our friends never to shop in that store. Yale, if you behave like this, I'm going to tell everyone I know. I would think twice about spending a dime there. I think their best days are long behind them. I don't know. We have to speak up. I also think that those of us who see what's happening in America, we have to speak up. If you don't speak up, you have become part of the problem. This has happened before. We're only human beings. We're not exempt from going down the path of Germany in the 30s or going down any of the paths that we can look at in history. We're human beings. If we don't do the things necessary to keep the republic and to keep ourselves free, we will go down that path. So I guess, when my book recently has been subject to this kind of stuff, I just think it's interesting, but they don't have ultimate authority. They can do this to a few people now, but if we speak up, if we band together, if we have forums like this, I simply think in a place like America, it is not going to be possible that if enough people are aware of this, enough people see what's going on, they're going to, we have a free market, we have other options. And so I think that places like Yale, I don't think they're going to deal with this, but their only hope is to deal with this head on, to look at themselves and figure out what they believe and what they're willing to do.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'll turn it over to John. John, do you have a closing statement?
Well, if I were running a company, I would think long and hard before hiring anyone who went to Yale or Harvard or any of these schools, unless they could prove to me they were the president of the pro-life organization or members of college Republicans. I would think, my assumption when I hear someone went to an Ivy League school is, oh, someone who's thin-skinned, self-righteous, dogmatic, and litigious. And if you ever try to fire him, he will say, that's because you learned I'm 1/18th Pacific Islander, and I'm going to sue you into the ground. So I think the businessmen, many of whom are Republican, whether they know why or not, need to stop hiring these people. Don't see an Ivy League diploma as a certification of anything except sheep-like obedience, conformity, and cowardice, which I'm afraid in a very high percentage of cases, it is. We need to strip these institutions of their now undeserved prestige. They are finishing schools for upper class, woke dogmatists. We need to mock the new false religion. Use its sacred terms derisively. Talk about how your beer is racist because you don't like the way it tastes. Make fun of every aspect of their ludicrous dogmas. And remember, in the long run, history is not on the side of the people who are burning witches. It may look like that at the moment, but in the long run, history looks at them with horror and scorn. And people like the idea of poking the establishment. They like the idea of challenging orthodoxies. We need to rebrand the woke cult as what it is, a false, post-Christian, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish religion that we have our right as skeptics and free thinkers to blaspheme its gods and to spray paint mustaches on its religious statues and to treat its pieties like the toilet paper that they are in the eyes of the real God who is not amused.
Thank you very much, John. And then Bobby, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. I'm going to kind of close by just saying that I was a member of the left when I was at Yale. And I remember a lot of great things about it. I remember it was a place where free speech was taken as a given. I know that there are memories of the left being really bad even back then in the 80s and 90s, but I do remember glimmers of hope that have disappeared. I remember when it was common for people to say that Voltaire quote, "I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Who says that anymore? Why don't people believe that anymore? Why has that completely vanished? And I watched this because I was a professor from 1999 to 2019. I taught the millennial generation from the beginning to the end, and I saw how the campus left evolved. It evolved. It doesn't talk about working class issues anymore. It doesn't really even talk about any kind of material issues that would normally drive a revolution. It became concerned with all of these consumer causes about gender and sexuality and people's feelings and affect, and it rejected the whole concept of free speech, which I don't know how you can have a left without that. So I would just kind of close by saying that I don't come to this discussion personally wanting to bash the left or completely say, they're hopeless, they're awful, they've always been awful. I think that there were good things that they could have contributed. They could have been a really vital force in American society, but that all went away because of this cancer where they just, I don't know what took over them. There's so many discussions we could have. My friends that are still on the left that I still talk to, they say that I should always make sure to call it neoliberalism. Don't call it liberalism. Don't call it socialism. It's the neoliberals. Whatever you want to call it. I do remember being at Yale, having these conversations in the dorm room, the excitement of being challenged with all these new ideas, and feeling like you were challenging structures of power and you were questioning authority, all of that. And I don't know how they got from that to them wanting to get people fired, wanting to censor people, wanting to ban books, wanting to deplatform folks, sending death threats to people because they used the wrong pronoun. I don't know what happened. I hope at some point somebody at Yale can, do a postmortem and figure out what happened to the left that I knew. So.
Thank you, Bobby. Very well said. In conclusion, if this has resonated with you tonight and you're a Yale alum, please consider joining the new organization we're setting up for Patriotic Yale Alumni. If that's of interest, please email us at the number 4God, 4 country, 4 Yale at protonmail.com. We'll get you into an organization for patriotic Yale alumni who have a common faith and common values and want to make Yale the best place that it can be. Thank you to our great guests tonight. Much appreciated. Excellent points. Again, Eric Metaxas, John Zmirak, and Bobby Lopez. Thank you so much for your eloquent points and for joining us for our conversation this evening.
Thank you. And just one last thing. This will be posted online on those different websites as a restream. So you will be able, if you missed part of the show, you can go back and get it. Thank you so much for having us on, Declan.